kids! Today I'm gonna tell you the new story. It is a wonderful story about Mrs. Crump and a cat. A wonderful thing happens when she opened the door, and what she found? A friend, a cat. Mrs. Crump's cat. She's Mrs. Crump, and this is the cat that she found at her doorstep. Let's read the story. One rainy day, Mrs. Crump opened her front door to fetch the paper and discovered an exquisite golden cat shivering on her porch step. Hoo, hoo. Shoo, 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 she cried. Shoo, go away. But the cat did not go away. I will have you know, Mrs. Crump said, I have no use for a cat. Look at the cat. Mrs. Crump turned away, but somehow the door did not quite shut, and the cat slipped in. I should have known, Mrs. Crump said. Cats are sneaky by nature. Oh, really? She rustled along into place, then watched as the cat primed and polished itself in front of the fire. When the cat is dry, Mrs. Crump thought, I will send it on its way. But when the cat was dry, it curled itself around Mrs. Crump's ankles like a soft velvet ribbon and meow hungrily. Meow, meow. Mrs. Crump went to her pantry and got a slice of bread, but the cat would not go near it. Just as I suspected, Mrs. Crump said. Cats are finicky as well. Mrs. Crump decided she would have to go to town, and she threw on her overcoat. Tonight, she said to the cat, I will send you on your way. Mr. Henry, he is Mr. Henry, he nodded his head and said, Good day, when Mrs. Crump entered his store. Good day to you, Mrs. Crump said to Mr. Henry. Curtly, she said, Good day, and was a bit surprised she would say even that. Mrs. Crump paid for a pint of cream and had started on her way. When she changed her mind, What is it? Something else? The grocer asked. And before she even thought the words, Mrs. Crump found herself asking that a shiny red bat dish be added to her order. Do you have any new dog? Mr. Henry is asking Mrs. Crump. Do you have a new dog? I do not, Mrs. Crump said. I have a stray cat. Don't feed it, Mr. Henry warned to Mrs. Crump. If you do, you will never be rid of it. It was the strangest thing, Mrs. Crump thought, but somehow the way back home seemed far shorter than the way there. That night, Mrs. Crump filled the shiny red dish with the cream and added another log to the fire. Soon the bowl was empty and the cat was full. It was time to put the cat out. Oh no, what's happening here? Mrs. Crump stood at the door with the cat in her arms. She looked up at the clear, starry sky. She poked her nose and sniffed the cool, dry air. Mrs. Crump looked down at the cat, and the cat looked up and purred magnificently. I smell rain, Mrs. Crump decided, slamming the door shut. It would be foolish to turn out a dry cat only to have a wet one on the porch step again come morning. Tomorrow, she said to the cat, I will send you on your way. See, she is telling to cat, I will send you on your way tomorrow. The next day was bright and sunny, and Mrs. Crump was a bit disappointed. It was a lovely day to turn the cat out, but it seemed such a shame to waste a half pint of cream when she had travelled so far to buy it. It will only spoil, Mrs. Crump decided. When the cream is gone, I will send the cat on its way. Mrs. Crump poured the last of the cream at breakfast. The cat stretched and yawned and circled the bowl, then stopped and scratched. Mrs. Crump parted a bit of its golden fur and saw, to her horror, a single flea, oh, which is flitting between the cat's ear. I will not have critters of that sort in my house, Mrs. Crump declared. Before you go anywhere, she said to the cat, you will need a good scrubbing with brown soap. A lot of trouble you are, Mrs. Crump said, throwing on her overcoat, and she pulled the door shut behind her and headed for town. Hello again, Mr. Henry said as Mrs. Crump entered his store. And hello again to you, Mrs. Crump said to Mr. Henry, but not quite as curtly as before. Mrs. Crump paid for a bar of brown soap and a pint of cream and had started on her way when she changed her mind. What is it? Something else? The grocer asked. And before she even thought the words, Mrs. Crump found herself asking that a dainty yellow collar with a silver bell be added to the order. I take it you still have the cat, Mr. Henry said. I would have turned that cat out long ago, Mrs. Crump explained to Mr. Henry. But it's been one thing after another. And now I am afraid the cat has forgotten its way. Hang a sign in my store, Mr. Henry saying to Mrs. Crump. You can hang a sign in my store. If someone claims the cat, your troubles will be over. And if no one claims the cat, Mrs. Crump asked Mr. Henry, I am afraid you will have no choice but to keep it, Mr. Henry admitted. It was the strangest thing, but somehow Mrs. Crump had never noticed before what a smart man Mr. Henry was. She's thinking, wow, Mr. Henry is really a smart man. That evening, after the cat's bath, Mrs. Crump made up a sign, a very small sign. She started to write found, Found, found. One exquisite golden cat inquired within. But she changed her mind. She turned the paper over and thought a bit. I did not find you, she said to the cat. You were on my porch step, after all. She wrote the word Found found in very small letters. You have been sneaky and finicky and plenty of trouble, Mrs. Crump reminded the cat. And you were not really very exquisite when you found me, Mrs. Crump decided. You were wet. Mrs. Crump wrote the word wet, wet, in very large letters. I could hardly have called you golden, Mrs. Crump said. You look plain yellow to me. Mrs. Crump wrote Yellow, yellow, next to the word wet, wet. And to be fair, Mrs. Crump thought I must not forget about the fleas that I found nearby your ear. Finally, she set the sign down and stood back to admire her work. It read, Found, Found, one, only one, sneaky, Sneaky, finicky, Finicky, troublesome, Troublesome, wet, wet, yellow, cat, with fleas, fleas. Mrs. Crump was at Mr. Henry's store first thing in the morning. She pinned the sign in a dusty corner. Okay. See, Mrs. Crump had pinned the sign in this dusty corner, and Mr. Henry promised to let her know the minute someone inquired about the cat. The very next evening, in fact, Mrs. Crump was back at Mr. Henry's store. Sorry, Mr. Henry said to Mrs. Crump. No one asked about the cat today. A pity, Mrs. Crump said, paying for 6 fat livers and a can of tuna. Mrs. Crump found herself signing on the way home. Finally, at the end of the week, Mr. Henry showed up at Mrs. Crump's door with the dusty sign in his hand. No one had claimed the sneaky, finicky, troublesome, wet, yellow cat with fleas. It was the strangest thing, but somehow Mrs. Crump was not the least bit surprised. It's just as well, Mr. Henry said. You have bought a collar, soap, livers, tuna, 2 full pints of cream, and a shiny red dish. You may as well have a cat to go with them. Now, how could this happen? Mrs. Crump wondered. I had no use for a cat. Cats are clever that way, Mr. Henry said to Mrs. Crump. Before you know it, you will be sitting by the fire with the cat on your lap, wondering how you ever got along without it. Oh, really? Mrs. Crump is sitting with the cat on her lap. That night, Mrs. Crump put an extra log on the fire and did just that. Like this, they started staying together. This was the end of the story.